All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and all those inappropriate gendered terms that we, friends beyond the binary, there we go. We're going to start our last session. I am told that I have to be absolutely brutal about timekeeping because we've all waxed philosophical far too long. So with apologies to our speakers, I'm just going to introduce them and let them go, and I will give them a 2-minute warning and ask them to clue up as efficiently as they possibly can. So our speakers, sort of trying to abbreviate their bios now, Megan Walker, who was the inaugural Ewart A. Pratt postdoc of Naval, Military, and Maritime History at Memorial University. She works closely with the Maritime History Archive. She studies maritime menswear in the British Empire, and her work has explored the clothing of merchant seafarers, Royal Navy sailors, Marines, and now Newfoundland fishers, with an emphasis on the adoption of a ready-made or slop clothing of maritime workers. We have Raymond Blake and Hayward Blake. Hayward is very involved in education. He holds education degrees from Memorial University and the University of Toronto. He's been an educator in rural Newfoundland, an administrator in education. He's won awards in education, so he knows what he's talking about in terms of education. Ray Blake, professor of history at the University of Regina, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, has written extensively, more than 20 books about all sorts of Newfoundland history. And his most recent book is Canada's Prime Ministers and the Shaping of a National Identity. And we have Andrea O'Brien. She is a folklorist. She has a master's in folklore. She serves on Heritage Newfoundland's Register of Historic Places, Municipal Outreach Officer, Heritage Places, Poster Contest Coordination. It goes on, and she's very engaged in looking at commemoration of historical places, and today, especially in terms of women. So I think I'll just leave it at that, get people up on their feet or up on their toes to get started, and we'll enjoy this final set of talks.
Thank you so much. I introduced Willeen, and now Willeen's introducing me. So as Willeen has noted, I am an imposter here. I study men, but I am also a clothing historian. So I'm also typically an imposter in clothing conferences, because that is the one place where the line for the women's bathroom is too long and the line for the men's bathroom is non-existent at conferences. So typically I'm the odd one out at clothing conferences as well, because if you study clothing, even if you're studying men's clothing, you're always studying women, studying their labor, studying their contributions to both the economy and to the domestic and community life, as we've already heard today, and as well yesterday with so many references in Dr. Dooley's talk about or the early suffrage movement, or the suffrage movement itself. So I am very interested in what Willeen mentioned as ready-made clothes or slop clothes, which is clothing that's already on the rack, and we are all used to that. That's literally how we shop. And what's unique about men in clothing history is that they're the market that was being served by ready-made clothes. So when I'm looking, so women's clothing came later. It was not the initial market for ready-made. So when we're talking about things like mail order catalogs and department stores and high street shopping and things, women were going to shops and shopping, but it was much later that women's actual finished dresses and garments started appearing in those sales spaces. Men's clothing was the early market. And so I typically deal with sailors on an international scale, men moving in the British Merchant Marine who were dying in the papers held at the MHA, the logbooks and crew agreements, and they would leave inventories. And the inventories are typically very brief. So I turned to look at the Ryan Co. journals to sort of figure out what men might be wearing in terms of fabric in rural maritime communities, to sort of get a sense of what people might prefer when they went to sea. So, so that's what we're going to see right here. This is for 2 years in Bonavista, 1863 and 1873. And this is in pounds, the consumption of this community through the Ryan's books over 2 years with a decade in between. Now, 63 is obviously the more depressed year. You can see the pounds height on the y-axis is 50 pounds, and the pounds axis, or on the pounds, is 140. So the amount of consumption is going up over time. But what I really want to pay attention to is actually the green columns, so which are all quite tall. And this represents all the raw material, the raw fabric that's going into households. This is not the ready-made clothing that I'm interested in, which is the minority. It's the purple column. Sorry, it does look a lot better up there than it did on my little computer screen. So what that represents is all women's labor, because it's raw fabric going into households, and at some point it must be getting processed into clothing that then men are wearing in the communities. And that transformation for me using the Ryan journals is kind of a black box. I can see who's purchasing the clothing by account, and that sometimes you can see that women are coming into the store and making those purchases, but what they're actually doing with it is in some senses a mystery, but also not a mystery, because in the 19th century, there was just a lot of fabric. So this is the top 20 different kinds of fabric being sold or being purchased in Bonavista in those 2 years. And this is out of about 60 or 70 different kinds of fabrics. Now, I don't know if anyone here can name 60 kinds of fabrics. Today, because we shop ready-made, because we shop fast fashion, a lot of us don't actually think about what fabrics we buy, what are fabrics. The difference between silk and satin apparently eludes us all. So, but because it's the 19th century, these fabrics are extremely specific. They're different types of fibers or different weaves, and they're all being used for different purposes. And in some cases, then we can narrow down what the intent of the end product might be by the purchase of the fabric itself. So obviously the most common fabric is the first one, calico. In Newfoundland, that would be a white cotton, not a print. In the United States, I think it's a print. And so this would be for all types of goods, men's shirts, but also like women's undergarments, their shifts, their petticoats, maybe even like less fancy shapewear. The word stays is still in Newfoundland lexicon into the 60s and 70s, and corset, the word corset doesn't appear in the records until the 1880s. But so you can see why that category is the most common. But you also have print ginghams, orleans, and plaids that are being used for lightweight, colorful women's dresses, men's shirts. There's a specific fabric called regatta that is also specifically used for women's aprons, apparently, and children's clothes, which suggests that it is a plaid, but it's more tough. Then we get flannels and wincies, which we all know what flannels are. We still wear them for warm undergarments, men's shirts, children's clothes. Women were probably also wearing flannel petticoats and other flannel garments. We have heavy woolens, homespun stuff, and tweed, which were all being used for coatings. Specifically or particularly expensive homes or woolens would have been used for probably men's overcoats, but all outerwear would have been made from these mostly waterproof woolens, which would have included women's coats. Moleskins, serges, and dungarees were used for pants. Moleskin is one of the great animal fabrics. Moleskin, swanskin, doeskin, and wild boar. So all imitation animal fibers, but they're all woolens. I do have a reference that thinks swanskin is a leather. So like they're tanning the skin of swans, which is very magical, but not, as we will see, the actual meaning of the word. And obviously canvas is flying around these communities as sail canvas, but also being treated with linseed oil to become oilcloths. And probably the sewing of these garments would have been women doing this work, and then the linseed oil treatment would have been men. And there were specialist craftspeople who worked with linseed oil and produced oilcloths professionally. But I'm going to come back to the one I skipped, which is Coburg's, with a specific consideration to Bonnie's talk, because Coburg is a cheap black fabric that is specifically associated with the mourning clothes of poor people. So these garments were being purchased for wakes, and in the 70s and 60s, that link is kind of amorphous. I would have to actually go in and check records to see when people died. But in the 80s, I actually have instances of funeral objects being purchased when Coburg is also being purchased. So the mourning association with Coburg does become apparent when they can afford other mourning accoutrements later in the century, which I find really fascinating. But yeah, but it's a well-known fabric for associated with mourning. But I didn't mention one fabric, and that's swanskin. And I wanted to specifically talk about women's labor in association with swanskin, because it's associated with a particular kind of Newfoundland clothing objects, the cuff and the buskin, which are identified as male garments that are expressly unique to Newfoundland, and probably also, and I think also Labrador. So the cuff and buskin, you see a pair of cuffs here. They're the only examples of 19th century swanskin we know of in the world. I would hope to be wrong about that, but anyway. So cuffs are large mittens. They often cover knit mittens, so they go over the hands. And buskins would have been like a gaiter type of footwear cover that would have covered the upper boot and the lower pant so that snow couldn't get into the boot. And a lot of foreign literature, so a lot of people coming from away, writing about Newfoundlanders in the brush or in the bush or at sea, talk about men wearing cuffs and buskins. But I do think that women also wore buskins, because the purchase of shoes in these communities is also would also be consistent with women not having high leather boots, and so they probably also had buskins under their dresses when they went outside that foreign observers probably didn't notice. So the buskin in particular, the cuff and the buskin become male-associated clothing because of this foreign literature. This is how it appears in the Dictionary of Newfoundland English, but it probably was less gendered than we assume. Now, swan skin is a really fascinating fabric. It is produced in one mill in Dorset and Sternmeister, Newton, which is not by the water. And it was, as early as 1808, was being selected by West Country merchants to export to Newfoundland. So the raw fabric of swanskin was being exported to Greens Pond as early as 1808, and becomes associated with this North Shore region of Greens Pond, Bonavista, and Twillingate. So by the time the Ryans set up shop in Bonavista in the later part of the 19th century, there's already a taste for swanskin. The community there, the women there are used to working with swanskin as the primary woolen for cuffs and buskins, and they and the Ryans provide that fabric to them. And the Sternmeister-Newton connection is particularly significant because there are people in Twillingate from that community that emigrated following the manufactured good, and not because they were fishers following the migratory fishery, but because they knew of Newfoundland through the fabric. And how we know this is unique to the North Shore is that Port de Grave, which had the merchants Blaine Johnston and Co., have a completely different set of woolens that they would provide to the community. So there's no swanskin in Port de Grave in 1818 when I did some preliminary research. So I don't know if this bears out, but I suspect. And instead, because they're Glasgow merchants, they import woolens and linens from factories in Glasgow and Leeds. So you can see this like connection, and these preferences associated with these communities, I think, get embedded into these communities, and then these get carried into the future. How women want to consume fabrics, or prefer what fabrics women prefer to work with. So in conclusion, clothing was important to Newfoundland, and women's labor supported the fishery on many fronts, turning raw material into clothing. I've been thinking a lot about the idea of like a gendered logistics. So I come from a bit of a military background, and I do think that we ignore gendered logistics, this domestic support work at our peril. Preferences for certain fabrics ran deep in these communities, and they were distinct from community to community. And unique apparel like cuffs and buskins were associated with men, but were probably gender neutral garments, and they were also sewn by women. And I skipped a little bit about how they're buying the swanskin that suggests that, but you can ask questions about that if you want. But anyway, women in Newfoundland preferred warm, hardworking clothing, and they probably also used a lot of fabric that were typically intended for men's wear because they were cheap and hardworking and warm. But they would have had some excitement. There were colorful fabrics, burgundies, prints, all sorts of things. So women would have had their Sunday dresses and would have had a little bit of fun in these communities. It wasn't all drab moleskin. So thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate. We've been watching from a distance today, and we're delighted that we can share our research with you about women, particularly those along the south coast of Newfoundland and take a few minutes to talk about one woman in particular, which is the subject of our forthcoming book called South Coast Woman, A Story of Resilience. And it tells the life of our mother, Minnie Beatrice Blake, who was born in 1919 and spent her whole life in and around Hermitage Bay on the south coast. And our story falls into the genre of what we call life stories. It combines memory with extensive archival research that we believe elucidates the life and times of not just one woman, but the life and history of women in her community and in her region. And we've divided our talk into two parts. I'm going to talk about how we went about telling her story, and then Ewer will pick up and talk about some of the stories and episodes that we focus on in the book. And we began with a simple question. Why should the life of Minnie Blake be of interest to a wider audience? And we believe that history is too often about the big events and the big picture of people and the big people. And when we do talk about women, we quite often talking about it in a general sense. And what we wanted to do was to bring to the limelight that history is about individual, ordinary women who play an important social, cultural, political, and economic role in the world in which they live. And we argue that individuals, and we need to identify them. We need to think about their lives, their full lives, which is rich, which is worldly, but often live in obscurity. And we make the case for individual women. They are historical actors, we believe, bearing and raising children, making and remaking families, managing and maintaining households, supplying domestic labor, and contributing to the household economy. These women provide a moralized social order, both in their families and in their communities, but they are often, as we've heard today, silent and without a presence in the annals of history for too long. Their stories need telling. And this is what we call a people's history, by offering a history as seen through the life of one woman. And then we approach our tasks. Well, first, we took what we think is a novel approach to defining family. Canada's pretty clear. It's family members. But to focus only on kinship is to miss the vibrancy of life in which families live. We include kith, an archaic word perhaps that means family and friends and neighbors. And we see neighbors and friends as extended family members, part of a community whose members all have to deal with similar issues. Minnie's experience was similar to what other women endured. Their experience was also her experience. In writing this book, we had to deal with about forgetting, not talking about not remembering the facts of an event, but consciously suppressing experiences or redacting events from memory. For Minnie Blake, history was a silent country she preferred not to visit. Life stories like hers allow us to uncensor some of the past. And we focus on women in action, some of which you've heard already today. Their interaction with the state, with other institutions, such as the church, in our case, and in her case, the local merchants. How did she deal with social and economic transformation? How did she act, for instance, as a young widow in a community which has certain expectations of her? The story we tell then is a portrait not only of a woman, but of the people and the experiences of many other women just like her. How did we research the life of Minnie Blake? Well, like so many people in Newfoundland and Labrador, she did not leave a diary. She didn't leave letters. She didn't leave very much. Her second husband, our father, could not read or write, so there's no great archive in that sense. But we did find there were things in court records. We found things in of course, the vital statistics records, but we also found tremendous information in the records of the Resettlement Division of the Department of Rural and Economic Development that managed resettlement, and these records are in the rooms, and they are probably one of the best records for outport communities in Newfoundland and Labrador. What we also try to do is to emphasize stories, and it's included in the title of our book. Storytelling is one of the most elementary forms of human expression. They have a universal quality because they reflect how people envision and imagine their community and how they live their lives. They tell it through stories, because stories are at the art of what we need to say and understand about our past, our families, and our communities. And we believe larger processes are really manifested through particulars, through the stories. They tell the life of ordinary people on a day-to-day basis. Plainly put, we believe the stories of one woman like Minnie Blake indeed represent the stories of many people in Outport, Newfoundland. And now I'm going to turn it over to Hayward to talk about a few of those stories and episodes that we talk about in our book.
Thank you, Raymond. As Raymond said, it's all about stories. And in this particular case, we've written a book which Flanker Press will be publishing. We hope to come out from just prior to Mother's Day in 2026. Now, we believe that it is the story of our mother, who we think, if anyone were to read our book, would see their mother in it, particularly women, born in and around the 1920s, 1930s, who lived in remote and rural Newfoundland, who had rather subsistence living. And, as Raymond said, our mother often didn't tell her story, not even to her family. Our mother was a woman who married twice. Both husbands died, both tragically, within 11 or 12 years of both marriages. She had, 3 children that lived from both husbands, but she also had a child that did not live with both husbands. And some of that, of course, represents, I guess, the treatment by the church at the time of women. For example, one of our mother's children was not baptized before it could be, it died. So therefore, back on the South Coast, I guess in the Anglican tradition, children who died before baptism could not be buried in the Anglican cemetery. They were actually buried outside of the cemetery. And, we didn't know that until we started to put together, this book and started talking to people. And I think it's an example of, how our mother Minnie was silent on the past, and that maybe the silence that she adhered to was a way for her to cope with the struggles that she had. Our mother and our father, who was her second husband, lived in a place called Pustru on the South Coast. And our father would go away to Nova Scotia to fish on the trawlers. And he would often go away in March, come back just prior to Christmas. And that was an annual routine for many of the people who who lived in Pushtrue and surrounding communities. And of course, during the time home, our father would reconnect with family. Our father would do the maintenance around the house. Our father would, get the wood and make all the provisions for when he would leave, and our mother would look after the house and the children and basically all of the affairs. However, it was one particular year in the 1960s that our father came home, and there was a fish plant in Golfless, and the manager of that fish plant in Golfless sent a telegram to my father and others who had returned from Nova Scotia that he wanted them to come and work on the trawlers that were operating from his fish plant in Golfless. And of course, our father refused, as did the other men. But this particular manager of the fish plant contacted what would now be Service Canada, the unemployment office, to report that these people had refused work. Of course, to make a long story short, our father's unemployment benefits were cut. He was left with no income, and our mother and our father had to decide whether or not to succumb, I guess, to the Golfless manager's requests and go to work out of sheer necessity of surviving. However, I guess our mother probably said to our father, "No, you're not going to work, and we're going to make do." And of course, here was, two people living in an isolated community with no income, no savings, but they were refusing, to bend to an uncaring fish merchant who would cared so little about time with family, time at home. It was all about just getting enough men to work the trawlers in his operation. And you can imagine the difficulty that that would have brought to our mother and father. They actually had to go on the dough, and they tried inshore fishing, and that didn't work. But this particular plant manager had reduced them to their lowest level of self-esteem. But maybe it was the beginning of something, in rural Newfoundland, that their refusal to succumb to the wishes of a hierarchy that they knew little about. So, it's these kinds of stories that that we have in our book. And I guess, I could go on, and I don't want to tell you every story in the book, because we'd like to think some of the audience would like to buy this book. But I will touch on one other, and that is resettlement. And, our mother resettled twice. And, and resettlement for her meant trying to find a better way of life for her children, trying to find better health care, trying to find better education, trying to find a better life. Because our mother believed that education certainly was the ticket, was the way that her children could move beyond the life that she and our father had lived. And, resettlement brought the opportunity for better schools. And there are times when we often think about, we often hear that, resettlement was a terrible thing. It may have been done terribly, but the advantages that our mother saw in resettlement were great and many. I'll stop there and move on, I guess, allow the next presenters, and we'll stick around. I'm assuming there may be question and answer.
My presentation is not going to be academic. I'm as much a lapsed academic as I am a lapsed Catholic. So this is just going to be a story, basically what I do at work and the way I approach what I do at work. And I apologize in advance to any white guys here. I like white guys, but that was a catchy kind of little add-on to my title. But I prefer to actually research people other than white guys, but I also, you know, give respect to white guys' stories too. Okay. This is right in my line of view. Okay. If I ask my boss about my interest in old buildings and the stories of the lives lived within their walls, he might describe it more as an obsession than just a part of my job. I've been known to go down very deep rabbit holes in my attempts to place people from the past in these places. When I was first hired by Heritage NL in 2004, it was to research and write statements of significance for designated properties in the province to be placed on the Canadian Register of Historic Places. And 5 of us were hired for summer. We went back through a backlog of hundreds of designations that had very little written about them. At the time, the emphasis was very much on the architectural value of these buildings, but during our training on the associated values of heritage places, one suggested value field resonated with me, was how a historic building could embody a particular sense of time and place. And it quickly became an office joke that the statements I wrote could be easily identified by the use of that qualifier. While I have a great admiration for the techniques employed in the design and construction of heritage buildings, my passion for these buildings comes mostly from knowing the stories of the people that are connected to them. I pointed somewhere? And to be honest, the roots of my interest in uncovering untold stories, even those of women, can be traced back to a house that some old white guy built. That old white guy was my grandfather, Mr. Johnny O'Brien of Cape Royal. He had this house built in 1914. He moved his parents, John and Anne, into the house, along with his adopted brother, Billy. Over the years, his twice widowed sister, Ellen, also lived there, as did his nephew, Francis. He lived here with his first wife, Manny O'Brien from Bay Bulls, who died from TB shortly after they were married. He raised a family of 5 here with his second wife, Angela, who was the sister of his first wife. And it was also home to young women who were working there as domestics, one who married his adopted brother. His son, my father, raised his family there as well, making this place home to 4 generations over the 111 years since it was built. I never knew my paternal grandparents. Pappy O'Brien died just 6 years before I was born. Nanny died 2 months after I was born. But the house was saturated with melancholy memories and stories of the people who were there before me. Melancholy because of who my grandfather was. He was an outport merchant, a fact that was held against him, his wife, his children, and even his grandchildren who were born after his death. As a child, most of what I knew about my grandfather came from others, remarks made by adults to not believe what some people said about my grandfather, that he was actually a good man, that some people stole from him and made a joke of it, that he wasn't the kind of man to take people off the books while other merchants did. When I was younger, my father didn't talk to me about these things, but when his siblings visited the house, I would sit out of sight on the stairs by the kitchen door, and I picked up enough to know that their experience growing up was not the outport ideal that's sung about on the Sunday morning Irish Newfoundland shows. So my passion for digging up information came purely from a desire to know who my grandfather was. He was not born into money. He was in debt to Water Street merchants. He gambled and lost on a fresh fish processing venture in the 1930s. He invested in a fish dryer just before the bottom went out of the Salt Fish Market, his shop clerks were making more per year than he was. He lost his premises to the same sea that came into La Manche. He had no insurance. He died insolvent with a ledger full of unpaid accounts that were never squared up. People did not know his story. I was fortunate enough to have my maternal grandparents in my life until I was an adult, and I spent hours at their kitchen table being fed, playing cards, and just chatting. My grandmother, Man Rice, who you see here on the left, next to the lady with the broom in her hand, and that's Man sat down with all of her family around her brothers and sisters and parents. She grew up in the same lane that my grandfather O'Brien grew up in, although he was several decades older than her. She worked in town as a maid before she was married. She was there the day that Richard Squires was spirited out of the Colonial Building, and she told me a story about him that you wouldn't include in a history book. When she married Matt Rossiter, also from Cape Broyle, they had to live with her parents for several years after they were married because they didn't have their own house. They didn't have their own house because they never intended on getting married. Something she never talked about. Their first two children died in infancy. She was a patient at the sanatorium when the Knights of Columbus hostel burned, and she watched the flames from the window on her ward. She was a fabulous singer. She loved to dance. Poppy was a carpenter who often had to get by with hobbles. He left school after grade 3 and couldn't read or write, but he eloquently conversed through stories that spanned generations. The educational and professional path I ended up on and the way I view history and heritage was greatly influenced by these two very different family backgrounds. For almost 2 decades, I've been fortunate enough to have a job that continues to bring me to every corner of this province. I've seen almost every community from Nain to Rose Blanche. So many times I found myself looking through a stranger's attic at the bits and pieces of what people leave behind, the traces of lives lived. Nothing more than useless junk to some, but if you're otherwise inclined, they are the lines, verses, and unfinished poems of someone's story. Cradles that rocked babies to sleep, cases that held glasses worn to darn socks in the lamplight, shoes shined for Sunday church service, bedpans brought to the sick, a homemade mirror fashioned with whimsy and perhaps given as a gift, cellars that held a summer's labor and saw families through to the next harvest. Seeing these bits and pieces of other unknown lives is a melancholy racket at times, but it's also a privilege. And I have come to accept that it's my responsibility to make the unknown known and to give a name to those who own those objects, to find out who lived and worked within the walls of the buildings that we designate, and to bring their lives out of the shadows and show who they really were. The Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is also known as Heritage NL, is a nonprofit crown agency of the government of Newfoundland and Labrador. Initially, its mandate was to preserve the built heritage of the province through designation and preservation grants. Approximately 350 buildings are designated to date, and that's in the last 41 years. And since 2008, we've been entrusted with the implementation of the province's intangible cultural heritage strategy. In this province of storytellers, the marriage of built and intangible makes sense. The value of our built heritage is intrinsically tied to the intangible heritage associated with these places. It is the intangible that tells us why these places are important. By telling the stories of places, a greater affinity for buildings is fostered, along with a greater sense of stewardship. Without the intangible, these buildings are books with blank pages. Most of Heritage NL's early designations were buildings built by and for the elite. This was certainly the case in St. John's, where designations included mansions owned by merchants and politicians and grand churches representing the seats of different religious denominations. And this pattern continued beyond the overpass, where homes and premises owned by merchant firms and sealing captains were often the first to be designated as examples of the finest heritage architecture the province had to offer. So we end up finding these common male-centric themes among the earliest designations: ecclesiastical, mercantile, fraternal, and government buildings. And we also find that designations were concentrated geographically in those areas where Europeans settled to prosecute rich fishing grounds and establish those mercantile centers. In general, the early designations told the stories of successful settler men and their male descendants who had the means to build grand homes and institutional buildings. Out of the 350 designated properties, barely 2% were designated solely for their connection to women, and most of those were convents. As for the other 98%, women were usually not named in the official title of the designation, nor were they mentioned in any of the statements of significance. This is an example from Bonavista. James Grove, Henry Tremblett, Adam Mullins, Samuel Abbott, and Dougal Templeman all had wives, but they simply weren't recognized. Our updated plaquing program aims to at least get the names of women on the plaques. Our ongoing Women in Heritage initiative is aiming to tell the untold stories of the unnamed women who lived in these buildings, women who ran businesses, who contributed to building community spaces, who broke societal norms, and who were forces for change. Information is being collected from property owners, descendants, and through archival work. Women's stories are slowly coming to life, and in many cases, their stories are far more intriguing than the men who the buildings are named after. The statements of significance are being updated, and the materials being collected are being utilized in short media clips. And I have to thank my friend, my coworker Tara Barrett, for her video editing skills. And I have more to say, but I'll end off with 2 videos.
Louise Sims was born O'Sullivan in Kings Cove, Bonavista Bay. From 1913 to 1916, Louise played piano accompaniment for silent films in St. John's at the leading movie houses, including the Nickel, York Star, and Little Star theaters. Louise remembers, "It was a pleasant occupation. I sat at the piano right below the screen. If there was an old horse trotting, I'd play a trot. Fast action, I'd play something fast." She never took her eyes off the screen. Sometimes during intermission, Louise would sing a song herself. She studied piano at Presentation Convent and wrote all her Trinity College of Music exams. Louise earned $5 for playing 6 nights a week and became a well-known favorite in local theaters. She finished playing at the movies when she married Cooper William Sims of St. John's in 1916. The pair had 12 children and over 60 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. During the Second World War, Louise used to trade white flour that she had access to through the cooperage business for brown flour, which was rationed to everyone. No one liked the rationed brown flour, but Louise would use it to feed the horses that pulled carts for the cooperage. Louise and William moved into the Sims house registered heritage structure in 1947 after the death of William's grandfather. Naomi Burgess was born in Turks Cove in 1851 to Thomas and Hannah Pippi. After her mother's untimely death, she had to raise her younger siblings. She met Henry Burgess in Whiteway in the early 1870s, and they married in 1872 and had 6 children. Naomi was a midwife who delivered babies, including her own grandchildren, in Greens Harbor, Whiteway, and Cavendish. In the winter of 1890, while pregnant, Naomi slipped and broke her right arm. Unable to obtain medical attention until after the spring thaw, her arm became infected and was amputated. After losing her arm, she continued to help with births by directing other midwives. She also continued to turn fish on the flake and mend socks. When anyone in the family became ill, Naomi was the expert in traditional healing methods. In 1902, Naomi and Henry's home caught fire while they were attending church. Unknown to anyone, Naomi entered the burning building, trying to save new beds and clothes belonging to her children. After the original home burned, the Burgess Registered Heritage Structure was built circa 1903. The current property includes the home as well as a fishing stage, stable, store, cellar, and sawmill.
And I'll leave you with this picture. It just takes in everything that I feel about heritage. I just can imagine life being lived in that room from birth to sex to death under a blanket that somebody made with their own hands, and with those lovely mid-20th century green walls, which is one of my favorite colors, and looking out to the horizon. And if you looked over to the left, can you see something there? Can you see something in that snow? Yes, I think what you see in that snow there is someone she's still there reminding us of who she was. And that's my presentation.
Thank you so much to all our speakers for those wonderful talks. And indeed, I can see a theme there now in terms of, Andrea said, I don't fit, but you do in terms of the way that ordinary women and men live their lives and the activities that engage them. I'm told we have 5 minutes, 5 whole minutes. There's one more presentation to come. So let's see if we have a few questions from the audience on these wonderful papers. Yes.
No, I really enjoyed each of these talks for different reasons. So Rebecca, Megan, sorry. Megan, I was really struck by the range of different types of fabrics and the female knowledge that represented in terms of the materials, what they could be used for, how you would handle those, all the special techniques potentially needed. I just thought that's fascinating. The other thing I was going to mention, the white calico, women making shrouds. So don't forget that they'd use a piece of shirting to cut a shroud. So just planting that in there.
Canvas too, I would imagine that there would be some crossover from the maritime into maritime communities, because I deal with men dying at sea. They would be then wrapped in canvas at sea. So they're probably, if you needed to, could snatch some canvas as well and use canvas.
Yeah, and my grandmother used to use canvas for her floors. So put canvas down and paint it. Yeah, so just planting those seeds. And I think that like the Blakes, that ordinary story and recovering that story of someone who doesn't leave much behind in terms of written records is so important. And similarly, like Andrea, I think I often look in like even the folklore and language archives and all those fantastic, fabulous interviews that were done like through the 70s, and they're always dudes, right? You don't often see, unless she was a midwife. So you're going to interview a midwife, but those other women that if a folklore student was told to go out and speak to someone important in the community, make a recording, more than likely it was old Skipper, whoever, as opposed to the woman who was probably sitting there right in the kitchen, when the recording was being made. Yeah, so I think that women, and the great irony of that women were like in the private sphere, supposedly, and had all the responsibility for the household, and yet our heritage designation applies a man's name only to them. I think there's a big irony in that. Yeah. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Great papers.
I'll just add something to that point, which is that I work a lot with the Dictionary for Newfoundland English, because I deal with a lot of dictionaries, because I have to try to figure out what all those fabrics are. And one of the things I've noticed is that, especially with the secondary sources, it's a lot of like travel logs, like I mentioned with the swan skin of men coming to talk to other men. And so observing other men's clothing. And so like Bartlett's National Geographic's article about the seal industry, he talks about men's clothes, and that all gets filed away in the dictionary. And there's very little specialist language surrounding what women are wearing or what women are doing in the household, unless it shows up in the interviews that were also done. So the just like opportunity to learn what women are doing in the home was more narrow, and then it gets reflected in what turns up in like a very important resource for understanding like the province's culture, which is like so important and so great, but also like has some, I think, missing information.
One big difficulty we find is just the archival resources. Beyond St. John's, there's no archival resources. I just spent 3 days out in Little Bay. They had a house out there that had 3 generations of hoarders who kept every single thing, and I'm delighted they did. The guy who built it was a constable out there. He was a justice of peace. He was starting mines out in central Newfoundland. In the 1920s, him and his wife were traveling all over North America, not this, little outport woman who was stuck in the kitchen going nowhere. His daughter didn't marry, and I'm pretty sure that once I actually brought home some of her material, I would never be able to go through what they had out there in 3 days. They call it fan mail because her name was Fanny. So I want to go through Fanny's fan mail because I think she lived a very interesting life. She had 3 suitors that she basically told to shag off. And I think she was just loving her life and living her life. But they don't have the resources or the capacity to archive that material. And resources aren't even there in terms of grants, anything, you know, and that material a lot of times going to landfill. And that's why a lot of these ordinary stories are being missed.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to try to bring the Blake brothers in to her. Oh, you have a question for them? Yes, okay. Because otherwise I had a question, but we'll let Terry have the last word here.
Hi, Ray and Hayward. Nice to see you. I think the project sounds great. It is the ordinary stories that we need. And you mentioned, for example, resettlement. And so often that's told really from a political point of view. I mean, the poets and the artists have done a much better job of reflecting that big experience. But I liked what you said about, you know, the positives and the negatives of it, because so many times in history, an event or person is just seen as, you know, totally negative or totally positive, and really women's lived experience and men's lived experience is just so much more complex than that. And I think looking at an ordinary woman is how we can get at the fact that their lives were complex and were mixed. You know, events affected them differently in different times in their lives. And, you know, as today, change brings positives and negatives. So I look forward to seeing the book for sure.
Thank you.
You know, I would just add, I said earlier that our mother didn't keep a diary. After she died, she had the brown manila envelope that she kept a number of things in. One of the things she kept was the stub, I guess, of the check that she received from leaving Push-Through and moving to Hermitage. And as a single mom with, 6 kids doing this on her own, she had to have resilience and struggled. She bought a house. We sold everything we had, which the government bought, $2,400. She bought a house for $5,000. She had no money, no savings, and managing that on workers' compensation is a real story in itself, and we talk about that a lot.
At a traditional music event that I hosted, I've done a few of those now this year, but one of them this year, I was speaking to some gentlemen about resettlement, and I have all due respect, I think, the world of these 2 gentlemen, but their perspective of resettlement, I found, as the word I used earlier was jarring, because they think back at resettlement, and resettlement to them is in the tradition, the songs, the traditions, the music, and to them, their view of resettlement was that for men it was so disruptive because they were going to a different fishing grounds, and for women, well, it wasn't as bad for women because, a kitchen is a kitchen anywhere. You can be in, a kitchen in Greats Cove is the same as a kitchen anywhere. And do you remember that? I think you might have been there. Anyway, I bit my tongue a little bit. I can't remember how I responded, but it's some kind of respectful political statement. But it's so much more complicated than that. Like, to think you can just plank a woman from one kitchen to another, and that's her life, right? A woman's life was so much more than a kitchen.
But I think if we look back at the songs and the material that has been written about, and much of the music and the pictures we see, of the house being towed into Dover, Bonavista Bay, much of it in the early days was all from the male perspective. It's only recently that people like Bud Davish has written songs through the eyes of a woman, and maybe that's a a long coming recognition that women were prevalent during resettlement, and that women's stories were just as important as the men's stories. And but it took a long time, I believe, for artists to recognize that women had their own stories to tell and were an important part of the whole resettlement process.
Thank you. And on that note, I'm going to have to pull to a close because we do have a one final matter to attend to. But I think I'm very encouraged to hear how interested people are to pursue every possible angle to try to get into the lives of ordinary women and ordinary men, gender generally, across various types of ways that we insist upon organizing ourselves, like race and sexuality and all those things. Turn over everything that you can find. Listen to every story. I think it's really, really important. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much for these 3 excellent talks, and we'll move on to the next part of our day.